The president announced a deal with South Korea, which of course is a key U.S. trading partner, with just 2 days to spare before the deadline.
Along with the 15% tariffs, South Korea will invest $350 billion for investments owned and controlled by...
Donald Trump took action 2 days prior to the deadline he set for himself on August 1st. He declared an agreement to lock in tariffs at 15% with South Korea, a significant trading partner. Time to have the greatest possible political impact. That headline was loud and sudden. However, behind the festivities, there were a lot of important questions. According to Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, 90% of South Korea's $350 billion investment in the U.S. would go to Americans, all under Trump's direction, but no enforcement mechanism or legal foundation was provided. It recalled Trump's previous agreement with Japan, in which he made grandiose pledges of $550 billion in investments, only to be subtly retracted to a quarter of that amount. Once more, the calculations were off. Similar to Europe, which just promised to purchase enormous amounts of U.S. energy, it's unclear if these nations need that much, or if the United States can even provide it. Although their basis appeared to be flimsy, the figures sounded substantial. Similar to his previous accords, Trump's most recent announcement was a deal with South Korea. The agreement's formalization has been verified by Seoul, although there are still little details available. There is no explicit enforcement mechanism, no implementation schedule, and no legally enforceable treaty text. Since the reported 90-10 profit split hasn't been formally established, it raised questions. Trump appears to have a clear model: stack enormous numbers, disseminate them via benevolent media outlets, and give the appearance of authority. Fox News even asserted that tariffs generated $150 billion in revenue from overseas nations. But in practice, American businesses bear the cost of these taxes, which are frequently passed on to customers. Economic theater is what it is. The deals may appear spectacular on the surface, but behind the scenes, businesses are subtly hinting of price increases, layoffs, and declining profits. Citing uncertainties from these identical protectionist activities, the Fed has now postponed a rate cut. The deal with the Americans is still going on. Well, they might not come to a conclusion. Before August 1st, Canada's stance emerged as Trump was crafting his declaration about South Korea, and it wasn't what Washington wanted to hear. No agreement has been achieved with the United States, and none is anticipated by the deadline of August 1st, according to Prime Minister Mark Carney. Canada's message was obvious, but negotiators are still in Washington. Ottawa won't jump into a terrible deal. Carney characterized the discussions as fruitful and intricate, with a focus on defense, security, and investment. He did not, however, imply that Canada would follow the same route as Asia or Europe. Additionally, Canada opted for clarity over Trump's technique of announcing first, explaining afterward. No agreement unless the conditions actually help Canadians. Trump signed consecutive agreements with South Korea and Europe in less than a week, both of which were backed by billion-dollar pledges and patriotic catchphrases. However, Carney's failure to sign on despite the pressure of a fictitious deadline revealed a crucial weakness in the president's strategy. Trump placed a wager that before August 1st, all of his allies will submit. That tactic was successful with Seoul and Brussels, but Canada remained unfazed. The difference is now glaring. Despite Trump's claims of victory, his negotiation partners, from Europe to Korea to Japan, all subtly contest the terms. At least Canada is publicly stating this. This goes beyond a single lost sale. With every ostentatious but superficial accord, Trump is confusing the economy. As companies prepare for cost shocks, the Fed has already retreated due to the uncertainty. Furthermore, the White House may soon impose high tariffs, up to 35% on Canadian goods, in response to Canada's continued resistance. Cross-border trade would be severely impacted by that. Furthermore, Canada has made it clear that it will not be intimidated into submission, in contrast to South Korea or Japan. The scoreboard isn't as tidy as the headlines indicate in the last hours before Trump's deadline of August 1st. The agreements with South Korea and Europe appear hasty, ambiguous, and politically oriented. However, Canada may have made the most calculated move to date by delaying. Carney isn't only engaging in negotiations. The game is being called out by him. Now, everyone's attention is on August 1st. President Trump and other members of his team have described Canada as being cruel and unpleasant to deal with because of consumer boycotts. According to the Premier of Ontario, Canada must equal the tariffs imposed by President Donald Trump dollar for dollar. Though he rarely holds back, Donald Trump's remarks this time set off a chain of events that went beyond political drama. His hand-picked ambassador to Canada gave an explanation of why Trump views Canadians as cruel and unpleasant to deal with while addressing a group of business leaders in Washington. With Canadians are silently boycotting U.S. travel and refusing to purchase American alcohol, not due to serious trade infractions or military threats. It sounded like a casual insult at first. However, it exposed something much more telling: that the grassroots response of the Canadian people, one devoid of demonstrations and loudspeakers, was effective. Tariffs were the first step. In early 2025, industries that were heavily dependent on Canadian jobs, such as steel, lumber, and aluminum, were abruptly hit with high U.S. duties. Then arrived the discourse. Trump incited bewilderment and ire with his comments about Canada exploiting America. Canadians shifted their behavior from yelling back. Data from global travel websites, such as Hopper and Expedia, indicates that by July 2025, flights from Canada decreased by more than 26% to the U.S. British Columbia and Alberta saw the biggest drops. Alcohol sales in the United States have drastically decreased, according to Canadian liquor boards spanning from Ontario to Quebec. In certain instances, domestic or European brands were used to completely replenish shelves. Meanwhile, retail by Canadian and similar movements skyrocketed. Independent stores in Vancouver, Montreal, and Ottawa reported that their sales of goods created in Canada had increased from the same time last year. What began as a reaction grew into a movement that caught Washington's interest. It's clear that Canadians are furious, claim that Canadians cling on to it like a grip. The line. BC, according to Premier David Yai, Hoatra's comments demonstrate that Canada's attempts to oppose Trump are, quote, making a difference. Trump misunderstood the situation if he believed the provinces would give in to pressure. British Columbia David Eby, the premier, openly criticized the tone emanating from Washington. He did more than merely defend the boycott. It was evidence, he claimed, that Canadians were at last being taken seriously. Premier Doug Ford adopted a different, but no less forceful stance in Ontario. Rather of retreating, he urged Ottawa to retaliate with dollar-for-dollar tariffs. According to him, demonstrating being weak would only lead to increased pressure. Presidents from all political parties agreed on a single message. Even if it means changing their spending habits, Canadians have a right to defend their economy and sovereignty. We would want to inform our Canadian friends and neighbors that the Granite State is sending you our salutations and, we miss you. Although the ambassador's remarks caused indignation, not all Americans shared that sentiment. A few days later, a delegation of U.S. senators from both parties traveled to Ottawa. They did not disparage Canadians. In contrast to the ambassador, they were worried. Maggie Hassan of New Hampshire and Catherine Cortez, MTO of Nevada, pointed out that their states were already experiencing the pain. Shopping areas were quieter, jobs in the hospitality industry were under jeopardy, and Canadian travel was down. Canadians often make about 30% of foreign visitors in Nevada alone. This summer, that number, along with millions of dollars in revenue, has drastically decreased. It was no longer a trivial thing what Canadians did with their vacation money. It was cross-border economics is changing. Trump's bluster, according to many in Ottawa, just makes them more determined to boycott trips to the South and purchase Canadian goods. Some may argue that changing brands or skipping a trip are insignificant. However, taken as a whole, these decisions generated pressure that even Trump's administration was unable to ignore. This has nothing to do with feelings. It has to do with agency. The Canadians didn't have to yell. Their wallet did the talking. Perhaps the name was never truly an insult, but rather a sign of strength, if their decisions gave the impression that they were cruel and ugly. I believe that Trump is Trump, and we listen to him, but we simply let his words pass through one ear and out the other. Ultimately, diplomatic wording isn't the point of this moment. It has to do with posture. Despite Trump's dominance in the news, Canada is quietly and collectively displaying resolve. People, provinces, and premiers make daily decisions to maintain their ground, defend their property, and define their neighborly identity, not by threats or agreements. Because Canada is wearing it well if being cruel and nasty means not bowing to pressure. On Wednesday, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney and Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum announced their agreement to increase commercial cooperation. Additionally, the supply to U.S. markets will decline as nations look for alternative export markets. Dollars aren't the only way to quantify the true cost of tariffs. Trust has been lost, and it might not be regained in international supply networks. Under President Trump's most recent round of tariffs, trust in the U.S. as a reliable trading partner is eroding. Nations are no longer only adapting. People are reconsidering their whole plan. That change is particularly noticeable in Canada. Reducing reliance on American goods, services, and even markets is a national endeavor that started as a policy response to U.S. tariffs. Ottawa is expanding its commercial connections with Asia, Mexico, and Europe. Additionally, it is giving domestic production priority. It's an obvious message. Independence becomes essential if economic loyalty is penalized. The loss of confidence is more than just a diplomatic issue. Long-term changes are occurring in the places where nations invest, purchase, and sell. Additionally, the second Trump administration is on day 177. Additionally, new inflation data released tonight supports the predictions of numerous experts that Trump's tariffs would cause prices to rise steadily. The effect on American consumers is now indisputable. Based on the most recent in June, the Consumer Price Index showed a 2.7% year-over-year increase in inflation. Food, fuel, and durable goods all saw slight increases, but housing was the main driver. What many feared is confirmed by economists from Wells Fargo and Bank of America. Tariff expenses are directly influencing retail costs. According to the Yale Budget Lab, average U.S. import duties may reach a record high of 20% by August. The pain was postponed by early stockpiling, but now there is no cushion. Businesses are now restocking at tariff-inflated costs as supplies run low. The shelves are starting to reflect that change as customers drive their trolleys through the door. Quietly, Urban Grocer is resisting, avoiding anything cultivated in the United States. That has been the situation here for 117 days and is still going strong. Shop. It's a boycott. Canada's response north of the border is purposeful and forceful. For more than 117 days, a local grocery store in British Columbia has not carried vegetables grown in the United States. What began as a little cut swiftly evolved into a complete phase-out. Nielsen IQ claims that American cuisine in a few months, goods sales in Canada fell 8.5% by volume. More Canadians traveled to the United States than visitors from any other nation. Over 20 million Canadians visited the United States last year, spending over $20 billion. However, this many are
the
not
Asian
traveling to
continent
Americas.
has many
The
touristic
same is
gems,
true with tourism.
but none
For the sixth
offer such a
consecutive
rich
month,
traveling
car crossings from
experience
Canada
as
to
South
the US
Korea.
decreased
You
by
can get any
33%
experience you want.
in June.
Futuristic
Resorts
buildings
breweries in
and
Vermont
squares,
report a
impressive
30 to
palaces,
50%
and
decrease
inspiring
in
nature.
tourists. Some towns have changed
And when
their
you
names.
step into the country,
Streets
you
have
feel
provided
that
savings
amazing
on currency
energy.
rates. However,
Stay with
there is
us
more to
and
the
get to
absence
know
of
the
these
most
costs.
incredible
This is no
cities
longer a
in
choice
South
for many
Korea.
Canadians. It's a political position motivated by language they perceive as hostile and demeaning. At the same time, the U.S. market is experiencing the deeper impacts. American consumers confront fewer options and more expenses as overseas suppliers shift their shipments to other countries. Canada's supply shortages are already being filled by nations like South Africa, Egypt, Peru, and Vietnam. U.S. importers now have to deal with more logistics expenses, more paperwork, and fluctuating prices. Additionally, as more commodities are exposed to tariffs, manufacturing and retail are feeling the effects. This is no longer merely a foreign tax. It's becoming a strain on the household. President Trump cites increased tariff collections as evidence of progress, citing $64 billion in Q2 alone. However, these advantages are accompanied by an increasing credibility gap, trade distortions, and rising inflation. Under Prime Minister Mark Carney's leadership, Canada is becoming a silent but resolute counterforce. Canada is taking a longer approach, diversifying its trade, restructuring supply chains, and enhancing its internal resilience instead of reacting with threats. And all of this leads to that. In the near run, the tariffs might increase revenue. However, and in the long run, they might cost the U.S. the one factor that made it a leader in international trade: dependability. Because former allies begin to leave, it's difficult to return them.